Good morning, everybody. So the idea that I want to explore here is that psychedelics may act as amplifiers of the archetypal components of consciousness. This does make a difference. Psyche, as in psychedelic, generally refers to the mind of the individual person, whereas archetypes are transpersonal constructs, extending beyond the individual psyche into a deeper layer of consciousness, perhaps even a cosmos organized around meaning. Is this mic working?
It's just for my camera.
I'm afraid the mic is just
Okay.
For the camera recording. We don't have a mic for this room. So, would you be able to come forward a little bit, Tim?
Well, yeah, so look, I think what I'll do is if I can wait for everybody to come in, then maybe we can shut the door.
Yeah.
And I'll speak as loud as I can. If you can't hear it at the back, please stick your hand out to give me an indication that I need to tweak my volume control.
Thanks, Tim.
So we've already heard quite a bit in this conference about Huxley's reducing valve. You do sort of wonder what the relationship is between Huxley's reducing valve and the default mode network that we've just been hearing about for the loudspeaker. But of course the idea is that there's a much deeper layer of meaning that Huxley called mind at large, which is reduced to a measly trickle by the reducing valve. Albert Hofmann, who was the first intentional tripper on LSD and the synthesizer of it, I mean, he wrote his autobiography at the end of his life, and he thought that basically LSD changed the function of brain in a way so that it picked up a different sort of wavelength of meaning. I suppose these days we'd be more likely to use metaphors of downloading and uploading. We're actually downloading something. We're downloading something from a greater layer of consciousness. Perhaps even when we take our last breath and our heart stops beating, we're uploaded again into that layer of consciousness again. And then we have the idea from William James that there are all these other layers of consciousness which are just slightly to one side of us, but if we have a means of accessing them, then they're not too far away. We can actually access them. I was fascinated, probably like everybody else, by the afternoon yesterday, all the talk of the elves and the psilocybe folk and the entities that people are increasingly talking about. And I don't have those experiences. I have yet to have the honour of testing DMT. But I suppose my starting point of understanding that would flow from my training in shamanic journeying. And I was told that if you have a power animal like a wolf, for example, which you would have in shamanic journeying, that wolf is partly a projection of yourself, it's partly a real wolf, and it's partly archetypal wolf. But I was also told, in a way, it doesn't really matter because they're all reflections of a great spirit in some way. So we know that psychedelics take us into a different place, that they open the doors of perception. But how can we make best use of that opening? How can we perhaps stay there if that's what we want to do? Well, this was a question that preoccupied Richard Alpert in the 60s, and he was an academic psychologist. He was one of the guys that shared a corridor at Harvard with Tim Leary, and he was very interested in this idea. How can you stay there? Because of course the doors keep slamming shut, and he researched it in a highly motivated way. For example, with some friends, he took himself off to a house for 3 weeks, took 400 micrograms of LSD every 4 hours for 3 weeks, and he got high, and then he came down at the end of it. So like many other people of that generation, he went off to India to see if he could find some answers there, to see if he could find anybody that knew how to keep those doors open. And he went to India, and he travelled far and wide, and it was quite disappointing. He couldn't seem to find the sort of person that he was looking for. He had the feeling he was getting a bit disillusioned, not quite sure where his life was leading him, what was the next stage in his journey. He seemed to be running out of options. And then he finally did meet, he did meet his guru. He did meet a holy man, a man who seemed to have the answers that he was looking for. The night before he was going to meet this guy, and he didn't know he was going to meet this guy, he was sitting outside in the starlit Indian night, and he was having a nice moment of connection with his mother, who had died the year before, after a long illness, and it was quite a powerful moment for him, I think. And then the next day he was taken up to the hills where he met this old guy who was sitting in the hills with his followers, and the old guy didn't speak any English, and he said through an interpreter, "You were under the stars last night. You were thinking of your mother. She had a big stomach. She died of spleen," which is exactly how she died. So in that second, he describes this extraordinary feeling that this old Indian guy, living a very simple life up in the hills, had access to information that he could not have got by any conventional means. And so this guy had supernatural powers. He had what the Indians call siddhis. He seemed to exist in a level that was beyond the everyday level. And he had a wonderful sense of compassion. He was a very lovable man. He radiated love. So the reason why I'm telling this story is because sometime later, the old guy, who everyone called Maharaji, he asked Ram Dass if he could try some of his special medicine. It so happened that Ram Dass had some LSD with him, and it was specially made for him as a going away present. And each tab was 300 micrograms. And Maharaji poured 3 into his hand, and Ram Dass thinking, well, that might be overdoing it a bit. But he swallowed this 900 micrograms of LSD, and to cut a long story short, nothing happened. He didn't seem affected by it. So goes Ram Dass something to think about. Was there some sleight of hand? Did he really swallow it? So sometime later, he tried it again, and again, Maharaji took the 900 micrograms of LSD, which is a massive dose, and he seemed unaffected by it. So this seems to support the notion, if you believe the story, that maybe there are some people who are unaffected by LSD because they already exist in the place that LSD takes you to. So there's a Sanskrit word for the place that Maharaji seemed to live in, and Satchitananda, eternal consciousness bliss. And I suppose in Western terminology, using more Jungian terminology, we might draw comparisons with the self archetype. But it seems to me that any model that tries to understand how psychedelics actually work on a psychological level needs to take this effect into account. We could call it the guru effect. So if we come back to archetypes, I mean, one of the things about archetypes is that they're inherently indescribable, unknowable, and ineffable. So the basic archetypal form is beyond description. They're translated for us into various forms, and historically we've tended to name our gods after them. You can tell a lot about a civilization, about the archetypes that they favour, by the type of gods that they have. And if you look back through history, there are all sorts of civilizations, all sorts of gods, some very bloodthirsty, martial pantheons, some much more gentle, maybe advanced pantheons. They're all kind of reaching to describe these fundamental forms of meaning that are so difficult to describe. Archetypes are permanent and unchanging, whereas physical forms are transient. So something is beautiful to the extent that it participates in the archetype of beauty. Physical beauty degrades, whereas archetypal beauty persists. Archetypes are transpersonal, so they have one foot in your personal psyche and another foot completely outside your personal psyche. They're transgressive in that they transgress boundaries. We see that most clearly with synchronicities. They're teleological, and they pull you towards them in some way. And as human beings, we probably have a bottom-up loading from our animal bodies and our psychosocial conditioning, and perhaps a top-down organisation from a more archetypal world. And you could see that maybe we live our lives on the cusp of that mingling between those those two influences. So how do we open to archetypes? Well, archetypes are an archetypal opening, an archetypal crisis is perhaps only a situation where there's an overplus of meaning. So there's real intensity of meaning. I mean, as a psychiatrist, it seems to me that most people that I see are trying to manage an archetypal opening in some way. Perhaps it's a current archetypal opening they're doing, or they're trying to manage the aftermath of such an opening. So a high-intensity archetypal experience has the quality of a numinous experience. It has this sense of awe. It's huge, it's vast, it's overwhelming. It's very disruptive to ego structures. It really challenges our ego structures. And it has two qualities. It's bivalent. It can be very beautiful, or it can be dread-filled and terrifying. And I suppose that the most common form of that dread-filled numinous experiences, maybe if you watch a horror film, and it sort of seemed to me in the old days when we all went to Blockbusters to get our DVDs, and you go into Blockbusters and it seems that more than half the shop is full of horror films, and made me think that maybe we're inherently numinosity seeking. That might be the most accessible way, perhaps, that we can have one of these terrifying, mysterious experiences. And then, of course, we have synchronicities, and it seems that the deeper that you get into the archetypal layer of consciousness, that the more there is this convergence between the internal and the external world that you get in synchronicities. So how can we understand this? Well, my favourite quantum physicist is David Bohm. And we know from quantum physics, of course, that the solid objects that we see are not really solid at all, that everything at its most fundamental level is interconnected energy. We are all webs of interconnected energy. I mean, that's what quantum physics tells us, although it's really difficult to get your head around that, I think, unless you are a quantum physicist. But what David Bohm did was he took it further, and he gave us the notion of meaning as an integral part of the underlying universe. That meaning is a fifth dimension. That matter and meaning both come from the same substrate and are unfolded into the world that we see. And of course, we can probably only go so far into that meaning because of the constraints of our sensory apparatus, our brain, our cognitive systems. But if we can get a little bit out of our brains, perhaps something to do with your default mode network, then maybe we can go a little bit further into this area of meaning. If we're really lucky, we can get a taste of universal cosmic consciousness, if we're really lucky. So the story that I think, the story that for me is most helpful in understanding the relationship between archetypal forms and archetypal images, and how this archetypal energy kind of informs our biopsychosocial state, is the story of Plato's cave. It's a very old story, 2,500 years ago. Plato was a philosopher in ancient Athens in the Athenian Golden Age, and he was pupil of Socrates, and Aristotle was his pupil. So you have a feeling that this was the pinnacle, perhaps, of human thought. And the teaching story that Plato penned asks us to imagine a situation where people are chained in an underground cave. They're facing the back of a cave, and their gaze is fixed, so they cannot move their heads. They've been there since childhood. They know no other reality. There are two sources of light in the cave. One is from the sun outside, which filters into the cave, but you can hardly see it. It just takes the edge off the darkness. And the other source of light is from a fire. In between the fire and the back of the cave, which serves as a viewing screen, is a walkway where various objects and effigies are paraded. The people parading the objects sometimes talk among themselves. The images and sounds are projected onto the back of the cave, and the chained people, of course, take these projections to be their primary and sole reality. They think the shadows are real and that the totality of their perceptual experience emanates from these flickering shadows. How could they know any different? Asked Plato. So there are two parts to the story. In the first part of the story, one of the cave dwellers manages to get free of his chains, and he wanders up through the cave. And it would take some courage to do this, getting into unfamiliar positions. And he would most likely be dazzled by the firelight. He'd have an uncomfortable encounter with the effigies and the people controlling the effigies. It would be frightening for him. He'd probably have an awesome experience, a numinous experience, perhaps of a dark kind. Plato suggests that for many of us that would be intolerable, and it'd be much better, it would be preferable to return to the back of the cave and that's the world of the flickering shadows. In the second scenario, we're asked to imagine our explorer, our psychonaut, go all the way up through the cave. And he gets all the way out of the cave into the sunlight. Of course, at first he can't see very much at all. He's dazzled by the intensity of the light. But as his eyes become more accustomed, he can start to make out shapes and real objects, colours, and starts to feel a bit more comfortable in the multi-dimensional world outside the cave. Start to make out the forms of trees, start to become aware of the sky, the stars, the moon, and then Plato suggests that eventually you become aware of the primacy of the sun. That everything ultimately comes from the sun. Without the sun, there is nothing. The idea that develops from that is the sun is the metaphor for Plato's God term, and the great spirit, and everything ultimately comes from that. So imagine the man going back into the cave, says Plato. So he goes back into the cave. He would not really value the value system that the cave dwellers had built up about recognizing the flickering shadows and rewarding those people who are best at playing the shadow games. He wouldn't be impressed by that anymore. He also wouldn't be very good at it because his eyes would take some time to adjust to the darkness of the cave again. So he wouldn't be very good at it, and if he tried to explain to his fellows what he'd seen out there, they probably wouldn't be very impressed. It probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. Does this story ring any bells for us? Well, you could say it's the same today. I don't think much has changed in the last 2,500 years. What are the chains? Well, I would suggest the chains are our attachments, our anxieties, our insecurities, our greed, our addictions, the way in which we pull towards us the things that we think we want, we push away from us the things that we think we don't want. I think we here in Breaking Convention, we are the people who are interested in travelling out of the cave. We're the people who are interested in moving beyond the two-dimensional world, the flickering shadows. There's not many of us. And I wonder if, we're still a small minority today, we're still a small minority in Plato's day. Maybe we're always going to be that minority. We don't need to be a marginalised minority. Maybe we can find our voice in a way so that we can translate what we see from the cave in a useful way for the cave dwellers. That was certainly Plato's idea. He thought people should exit the cave, bring back something of use. Of course, the establishment doesn't like it. The establishment does not like people transferring their gaze from the flickering shadows. The establishment does not like people moving beyond the effigies, examining our psychosocial conditioning, finding out things for themselves. Which is possibly one explanation for the war on drugs. If you think about its relationship to psychedelics, with microdosing, well, maybe the sunlight just becomes a little bit brighter. The ratio of sunlight to firelight increases a little bit. The shadows have a bit more vitality, a bit more vigour. We might not notice it, but we're subtly enhanced. In psycholytic doses, we're taken up the cave to examine perhaps the effigies. We have an encounter with our shadow, the difficult aspects of our personality development, our emotional life. We can work with that in a way which is useful. If you're interested in that, recommend you go to Friederike Meckel-Fischer's talk this afternoon, who's a psychedelic psychotherapist working out of Switzerland, who can give a very good account of that. In high-dose psychedelics, if we're lucky, we can go all the way out of a cave. And that guru, Maharaji, well, maybe the reason why LSD didn't affect him was because he was already out of a cave. He's sitting in the sunlight. So these deep archetypal waters are so interesting. If you can access these deeper layers of the psyche, you can work in a much more powerful way with the bits of the psyche that need to be worked with. It has enormous potential for therapy, for healing trauma. But it's so powerful, and of course we know how easy it is for people to become unstuck if it's not done properly, and that's Icarus, who got lured by the self archetype, and it was so powerful that his ego dissolved, the wax holding his feather wings together got melted, and he crashed to the ground in a terminal way. So we're all familiar with the principles of set and setting, but it seems to me that integration maybe doesn't get as much attention as maybe it needs to be, because ultimately it's the integration which is going to help us to bring it all back home. Maybe it's not as much use as it could be to us and the people that we work with unless we can bring it home in a useful way. So this is Humphrey Osmond's second most famous saying. The first most famous saying was nicked by Ben Sessa for the title of his novel that was launched last night. Fathom, yeah, it'll come. But the point is that psychedelics are the mindcraft of the mind sphere, the newer sphere. And Minecraft must be used with crews who are well trained, with ground staff of high ability, planning operations and monitoring progress. It's not just a matter of shooting rockets off into space and hoping for the best. So this shows holotropic breathwork, which was the training that I did. And I'm just putting this slide here because I think holotropic breathwork has really nailed the setting and integration. And it's a way of accessing a psychedelic experience without taking a substance. So what this picture doesn't show is it doesn't show the loud music, but it does show somebody having a 3-hour experience, being very devotedly looked after by a sitter, and then there's a whole range of integrative methods that happen after that. Stan Groff and Christina, who invented it, Holly and Deb, who run Holotropic UK. It can be done in very large groups. That's in Moscow, where I think there are about 500 of us. So I think that's probably the only holotropic breathwork session I've been in where maybe the integration was a bit suboptimal. And the most important aspect of working with these states is that it is essentially benign. If you go into these states and you're looked after properly and supported through the difficult bits, through the encounters of shadow, it has a happy ending. But the process is natural, integrative, and orientated towards our health. Unfortunately, there's almost certainly going to be an encounter with shadow. There's almost certainly going to be a process where some bits of our ego have to get changed. So in order for it to work, the ego needs to dissolve, some parts of the ego need to dissolve. We need to form a new relationship with the self, and the ego gets reborn in some way. And in these sort of controlled settings, what might be a bad trip in an uncontrolled setting is a wonderful opportunity in a controlled setting to really access and work with the deep material that we probably need to work with in order to advance our journey. So I think this symbolizes what the process of ego death and rebirth can sometimes feel like. It's kind of an ecstatic, glorious, but deeply painful process, and it's a struggle. So I'm going to leave you with that. Thanks for listening.